Okay, Masechta Sukkah, Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. Lulav harava shisha v'shiva, hahalal v'hasimcha shmoina, Sukkah v'nisach hamayim shiva, v'hachalil chamisha v'shisha. In addition to the two mitzvahs discussed so far in the Masechta, which is mitzvah Yeshiva Sukkah and the mitzvah of Daled Minim, there are another 5 special mitzvahs that apply on Sukkahs, making a total of 7. The Mishnah lists all 7 mitzvahs and states the number of days of Sukkahs on which each of these mitzvahs is performed. Lulav harava shisha v'shiva, the mitzvah of lulav, taking the Daled Minim, and the mitzvah of harava, which is the mitzvah of walking around the mizbeach while holding haravas and leaning them against the mizbeach. The mitzvah of lulav and harava, sometimes the mitzvah is described in Mishnah Hey and Vav. It should not be confused with the mitzvah of taking 2 haravas together with the lulav. They're performed in the Beis Hamikdash either on 6 days of Sukkot or on all 7 days. When would it be 6? When would it be 7? So the mitzvahs of lulav and harava sometimes override Shabbos, in which case they're performed on all 7 days of Sukkot. Sometimes they do not override Shabbos, in which case they're performed on only 6 days. This is explained in the following 2 Mishnayos. Hahalal v'asimcha shmoina. The mitzvah of reciting halal and the mitzvah of simcha of v'samachta b'chagecha are performed on all 8 days of Yom Tov, that is the 7 days of Sukkot and the 1 day of Shmini Atzeres. So Torah says, v'samachta b'chagecha, you shall rejoice on your festival, which is referring to the Yom Tov of Sukkot. When the Beis Hamikdash stood, the mitzvah of simcha was fulfilled by eating b'sar shlamim. If a person did not have enough meat from his karbanos for this purpose, he would bring a shlamim known as shalmei simcha, shlamim, offerings of joy. Today, the mitzvah is fulfilled in other ways, as we state in Shulchan Aruch, that in simcha l'basar v'yayin, and for children you give them their things, and for the women you give them their things, which will be discussed in Mitzvah Shem and the Shurim on the Gemara over here. And also, this mitzvah simcha applies on the mitzvah on the Yom Tov of Shmini Atzeres, which is the day following Sukkot. On Sukkot, we say Hallel every day, although on Pesach we recite it only on the first day. Saying a Hallel on all the other days of Pesach is merely a minig, and to show that it's a custom, we don't recite certain parts. Every day of Sukkot requires its own Hallel, because a different number of karbanos musaf are brought on each day, and making it somewhat separate from the other days. On Pesach, however, the musaf offerings are the same every day, hence reciting Hallel on the first day is good enough for the entire Yom Tov. We also say the whole Hallel on Shmini Atzeres, which is the Yom Tov that follows the 7 days of Sukkot, because Shmini is regal b'fnei atzmai. It's a Yom Tov in its own right, and it's learned out from a pasuk in the Torah that the mitzvah of simcha applies not only on Sukkot, but it continues through Shmini Atzeres as well. Sukkah v'nisach hamayim shiva. The mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah and the mitzvah of pouring water on the mizbeach are performed on all 7 days of Sukkot. When the morning tamid, when the korban tamid shal shachar is offered on each day of Sukkot, a kohen pours water on the mizbeach, and this mitzvah is referred to as nisach hamayim. The mitzvahs of sukkah and pouring the water apply specifically for Sukkot and not on Shmini Atzeres. V'cholil, chamisha v'shisha, and the mitzvah of playing the flute together with other musical instruments at the Simchas Beis Hashieva is performed either on 5 days of Sukkot or on 6. The ceremony of Simchas Beis Hashieva, which celebrates the mitzvah of Nisuch Hamayim, is described in the beginning of Perek Hey in the next Perek. Playing a musical instrument is Asur on Shabbos and Yom Tov, so the Simchas Beis Hashieva is observed only on the days of Chol Moed that are not Shabbos. This could be either 5 or 6 days of Sukkot, depending on when Shabbos falls, depending on the year. Although the other instruments too were played at the Simchas Beis Hashieva, the Mishnah specifies the flute because it was heard over the other instruments. Right, Mr. Shem will discuss this a little more in the 5th parak. Mishnah Beis, Lulav Shiva Ketzad. The Mishnah explains the first halacha of the previous Mishnah, that the mitzvah of Lulav is performed in the Beis Hamikdash on either 6 or 7 days. So Lulav Shiva Ketzad, how is it possible for the mitzvah of Lulav to apply either on 6 days or on 7 days? Yom Tov Rishon Shechal Yes B'Shabbos, Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shechal Yes B'Shabbos, Lulav Shiva Ushar Kol Hayamim Shisha. If the first day of Yom Tov of Sukkot falls on Shabbos, the Lulav is taken on all 7 days. The Chachamim asur performing the mitzvah of Lulav on Shabbos, but they did not apply the Gzeira on the first day of Sukkot. The Chachamim were concerned the one might carry the Daled Minim through the streets to an expert to learn how to recite the bracha or how to do the nanuim, which he could end up being over the Yesod Deraisa of carrying in Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. For this reason, they also want to perform the mitzvah of Lulav on Shabbos, even in a situation where it's a mitzvah Deraisa. However, they didn't want to prevent observance of the mitzvah on the first day of Yom Tov, since the Torah requires the mitzvah to be observed everywhere on the first day, even outside the Beis Hamikdash, as we spoke previously in Perek Gimel. Performing the mitzvah on that day is considered more important than performing it on other days. The Chachamim therefore were matter the lulav to be taken on Shabbos if it's the first day of Sukkot, and they answered it if it would be if Shabbos would be any other day of Sukkot. Nowadays, however, taking the lulav is always asur on Shabbos, even when it is the first day of Sukkot. So in a year when the first day is Shabbos, the mitzvah of lulav is observed on all 7 days of Sukkot. But if the first day falls on any other day of the week, the mitzvah applies on only 6 days. In this case, where the first day is a regular day of the week, one of the last 6 days will be a Shabbos, so the Chacham asur taking the lulav on Shabbos, leaving only 6 days for the mitzvah. Mishnah Gimel, Harava Shiva Ketzad. How is it possible for the mitzvah Harava to apply either on 7 days or on 6 days? So it would be similar to what we just discussed in Mishnah Beis. Yom Shvi Shel Harava Shechaldes B'Shabbos Harava Shiva. If the 7th day of the Harava ceremony, the 7th day of Sukkot, known as Hoshana Rabbah, falls on Shabbos, the Harava ceremony is held on all 7 days. The Chachamim asur the mitzvah of Harava on Shabbos, but they did not apply the Gzeira on the 7th day of Yom Tov. Therefore, in a year where the 7th day is Shabbos, the mitzvah of Harava is observed on all 7 days of Sukkot. There's little reason to be afraid that the Harava ceremony would lead to Chilul Shabbos, because it's performed by the Shluchim of Sanhedrin and the Kehanim in the Beis HaMikdash who can be trusted, and they're much more zaras, as we'll see in a little bit. The Chacham, however, had a different concern. They're worried that if the Harava is always going to be mutter on Shabbos, people might think that it's more important than the mitzvah of Lulav, which is asur on Shabbos, unless Shabbos is the first day of Sukkot. As a result, people might not treat the mitzvah of Lulav as seriously as they should. Therefore, to put the two mitzvahs on the same level, the Chacham were geyser that just like the mitzvah of Lulav is performed on Shabbos on only one day of Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot, so is the mitzvah of Harava performed on Shabbos on only one day of Sukkot. It's very interesting. Nakuda, it's not as chamor as the mitzvah of Lulav, but kedei that it should be to give chashivas to the mitzvah of Lulav properly, so then we take away the chashivas, so to speak, from the mitzvah of Harava. Therefore, in a year where the 7th day is a Shabbos, the mitzvah of Harava is observed on all 7 days of Sukkot. But if the 7th day falls on any other day of the week, the ceremony is held only on 6 days. In this case, where the 7th day is a regular day of the week, one of the first days will be Shabbos, and you don't do it on Shabbos. So you only have 6 days to do the mitzvah of Harava. Mishnah Dalet, mitzvah lulav ketzad. As we learned in Mishnah Beis, taking the Dalet Minim on the first day of Sukkot used to be mutter, even on Shabbos. We learned in Perek Gimel, Mishnah Yud Gimel, and we described how the mitzvah was performed outside the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos, without being Mechal Shabbos, by carrying the Dalet Minim in Rosh Hashanah. This Mishnah explains how it was done inside the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. Mitzvah lulav ketzad. How is the mitzvah of lulav performed on Shabbos inside the Beis HaMikdash? Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shechal Yes B'Shabbos. When the first day of Sukkot falls on Shabbos, by Lichin Es Lul Veim LaHarabayis, the people brought the lulavim to the Harabayis before Shabbos. They were not allowed to bring them on Shabbos because it's also to carry in Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. However, they may be carried on the Harabayis itself, because the Harabayis, it has a din of Rosh Hashanah because it's surrounded by a wall. The Chazonim were like the Shamashim, ArtScroll teaches it, the stewards took the lulavim from them and arranged them on the row of benches on the Harabayis. The open area of the Harabayis was surrounded by benches which people could sit, and they were covered by a roof for protection from the rain. On Sukkot, the lulavim were placed on the benches under the roof so that they wouldn't be dried out by the sun. As elderly men who were afraid of being pushed when everyone comes to take the lulav the next day, left theirs in a special room designated for the purpose where they could safely retrieve them in the morning. And the members of the Bezdin taught everyone to say, if anyone receives my lulav, let it be his as a gift. This was necessary because people might mistakenly take lulav that belong to others, and one cannot fulfill his chiv on the first day with a lulav that's not his, as we spoke at the beginning of the third parak. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, where people brought their lulavim before Shabbos to shul, so it's not necessary to say that they will give the lulavim as a gift to whoever takes them, since it's not such a such a large number of people. It could be assumed that each person would recognize and take his own lulav. But when you have Gans Klal Yisrael going to Eretz Yisrael for the Aliyah Regel, and they're bringing the lulav in there, so there's a tremendous amount of people, so it would be much more mistaber to say that your lulav would get confused with someone else's, and someone else would take yours. The next day, Shabbos morning, they came to the Harabayis early in the morning. And the Chazanim, the officials, would throw the lulavim before them. But in the eagerness to perform the mitzvah with their own lulav, they would grab the lulavim and hit one another. Now, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it could be that it would get dangerous and it would turn into fights, but it doesn't necessarily mean that would happen. There was a certain eagerness that they were very excited to show Chavivus HaMitzvah. When Bezin saw that the people were in danger, they were massacring that everyone should perform the mitzvah of taking the talaminim at home or in shul and not in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, Mishnah Hey, Mitzvah Sarava, this is very interesting, something that we're not used to. Bisman Hazet, something that we don't do. Unfortunately, not zeicha to do this mitzvah. Hopefully, learning about this mitzvah should be Kala Isik B'Teiras Chatas Kilu Hikavchatas. So hopefully, our learning of these mitzvahs and these inyonim and these halachas should be Oila L'Rotzen to L'Fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ki'ilu Hikravnu Ki'ilu we were mekayim these mitzvahs, which is a way, by the way, to be mekayim any mitzvah that we don't do Bisman Hazeh, or a person who's not a kohen, or a person who is a kohen, by learning the sugyas, by learning the halachas, avad a person is mekayim, it's kilu he's mekayim these mitzvahs, and that's one of the ways how a person can be mekayim all tarek mitzvahs in his lifetime. So Mishnah Hey, mitzvah Harava Ketat. How is the mitzvah of Harava performed? Mokum Hayel Lamatim Yerushalayim and Ikra Moitza. There was a place below Yerushalayim at the foot of a mountain called Moitza, where Haravas grew in abundance. Yordan al-Sham, Umulaktim Misham Murbiyah Shal Harava. The Shluchei Bezdin went down there and they gathered large Haravas from there and brought them to the Beis HaMikdash. The Haravas were 11 amas long, as we'll see in a little bit why it had to be that big. Kehanim came, took the Haravas, marched with them around the Mizbeach, and then stood them up against the sides of the Mizbeach with their ends bent over the top of the Mizbeach. Okay. Taku vehiriu v'taku. They blew with the chatzotz rice a tkiya, a long note, a trua, 3 short notes, and another tkiya as an expression of joy. The Haravas were stood on the base of the Mizbeach. The top of the Mizbeach was 8 amas above the base, meaning the Yisoid was 1 amma high, and the Karen, the Gaga Mizbeach was 8 amas above that. And then in the corner, there was a Karen that was an amma high also. In addition, there was a Karen, 1 amma high at each corner of the roof, making a total height of 9 amas. However, Haravas would have to be slightly longer than 9 amas to reach the top of the Karen, because they did not extend straight upwards, but slanted a little. The Mizbeach was indented 1 amma at the 5 amma level, so that that's where the Kehanim would walk. Therefore, since the Haravas were 11 amas long, slightly less than 2 amas remained to curve over the top of the Karen and the Gag HaMizbeach. The Mishnah continues, B'chol yom hakivin es HaMizbeach pam achas v'oimrim Ona Hashem Mashiachna, Ona Hashem Atzlichana. On each day of Sukkot, except the 7th, they marched around the Mizbeach one time, all chanting together, Ona Hashem Mashiachna, please Hashem save now, Ona Hashem Atzlichana, please Hashem bring success now. Suppose at the end of Hallel. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ani v'hoi Hashiachna. Rabbi Yehuda says they would say together, Ani v'hoi save now. The words Ani v'hoi are a shortened form of Misha Ani v'hu b'tzara. The one described as I and he are in suffering. This refers to Hashem, about whom it is said, Ima Anochi b'tzara, I'm with him in suffering. The Rav says, Ani v'hoi is b'gematria Ona Hashem, v'oid hem shnei shemesh b'shem ayin beis, which Rashi talks about more ba'arichos in the Gemara, that they were being ma'orer the shem ayin beis over here. V'oisa hayoyim ma'kifin as ha-mizbeach shava pa'amim. And on that day, the 7th day, Hoshana Rabbah, they marched around the Mizbeach 7 times. The march around the Mizbeach corresponded to the Yidden marching around Yericho in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. As I state in Yerushalmi, as the Psukim tell us in Yeshua and Perek Vav, Hashem will have a share on that too. They marched around Bli Neder. They marched around the city once a day for 6 days, and 7 times on the 7th day. Just as the march around Yericho resulted in the downfall of our enemies, our tefillah is that our marching around the Mizbeach will cause the downfall of our enemies. Nowadays we commemorate the Arava ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash by bringing a Sefer Torah up to the Bima in the shul, and we walk around it while holding the Daled Minim. On the first 6 days we make 1 hakafa, and on the 7th day, Hoshan Rabbah, we make 7 hakafas. We also follow another minig that was instituted by the Nevi'im to take Arava branches on the 7th day and beat them on the ground, which is what we do. Hoshan Rabbah, we do these 2 things on Hoshan Rabbah. Now, Hoshan Rabbah is a very enigmatic type of Yom Tov. It's very not mevur in the Paiskim or even in the Gemara. what's miyuchad about Ishan Rabbah. This is Kemat, the only place that it's discussed. But Kedua Morein Ramosha Shapir Zachan Lavracha would give a very big, a very major shir on Ilal Ishan Rabbah. It was a big avodah by him. Ishan Rabbah. It was a big avodah by a lot of people, but it's a very hidden type of yantif. It's a yantif within a yantif. It's a yen hadin. It's more of a Kabbalah digi yantif. It's not in the nigla parts of Torah as much. Okay, when they would finish the ceremony of marching around the mizbeach, b'shas petiras and mahinaymer, when they were about to leave after performing the Arava ceremony on Ishan Rabbah, what would they say? Who says they would say anything? But obviously the Mishnah is telling us that they said something. Yavilucha mizbeach, yavilach mizbeach. The beauty of the ceremony is for you, Mizbeach. The beauty of the ceremony is for you, Mizbeach. We performed this beautiful ceremony for you, Mizbeach, because you're mechaper for our averis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu atones for us in the merit and the schos of the karbanos that we performed on the Mizbeach. And there's a tremendous amount of karbanos that were brought throughout the Yom Tov Sukkot. And we know that there were Shivim Parim, there were 70 cows that were brought throughout the Yom Tov Sukkot, which are connected to Shivim Umas, which are connected to 70 nations of the world. And it says in Chazal that if the Goyim would know the Toiva that these Karbanos did to protect them, they would never have destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, they would have protected it from their enemies from being destroyed. Now we know that the transition from Sukkot to Shmini Atzeres is as follows. The Medrash brings a mashal to a king, the Gemara also brings it, as the Medrash elaborates more, a mashal to a king who celebrates with his people. And then after everybody goes home, he says, "Ani va'ata nismach b'yachad, me and you, let's have a small suda together, let's have a small celebration together." So when we're finished being makar the karbanos for all the umas, we're going into bringing a small suda just for us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Nagila b'nismach habach, state in Medrash, Nagila b'nismach habach, bach b'terasach, just with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Bach is referencing to the 22 letters of the Aleph Beis. So we celebrate the concept of the Mizbeach, because the Mizbeach is what gives us kapara. And Shmini Atzeres is like the next level. Once you have a kapara, now you can go into the Nagila v'nismach habach with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rabbi Lezer says, L'ko, l'yo, l'lecha, Mizbeach, l'ko, l'lecha Mizbeach. To Hashem we express our acknowledgement, and to you, O Mizbeach, we express praise. To Hashem we express our acknowledgement, and to you, Mizbeach, we express praise. That is, we acknowledge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our king, and we praise the Mizbeach, which is dear to Hashem, because it serves as a kapara for our averis. Mishnah Vav. The Mishnah explains how the Arava ceremony was performed on Shabbos. Just as it's performed on weekdays, so too it's performed on Shabbos. Shabbos, except that on Shabbos they would gather the Aravas and bring them to the Beis HaMikdash before Shabbos, because it's forbidden to carry them from Rosh Hashanah to the Beis HaMikdash. And they would place them in golden barrels filled with water, so that they wouldn't wilt overnight, so that they would remain fresh and beautiful for the mitzvah the next day. Contrary to everything we have learned in the last few Mishnayos, the next time Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka holds that there was no Arava ceremony at all. The whole thing didn't exist. Rather, on each day of Sukkot, a ritual that involved lulavim was performed. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka, they would bring hardened palm branches. The word chariyos, in contrast to lulavim, refers to palm branches that were left on the tree until the spines hardened like wood, and the leaves spread out and stiffened. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka, the Torah uses the plural form kapos tomorim to indicate that two branches are taken, one for the mitzvah of the Daled Minim and one for the mitzvah of the chariyos shel dekel. And you beat these sticks on the ground at the side of the Mizbeach. On that day, every day of Sukkot was called the day of the beating of the branches. And according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka, this was done every day. Now it might be that this is the idea, putting together the idea of the Arava together with the Chibut Charayos. So that's why we have Yom Chibut Arava, which is the Yom of Ishan Rabbah, which, as we said, needs a lot of explaining, which we're not going to do now, but Mitzvah Shem we will get to. Mishnah Zayim. This is a favorite Mishnah for many children, young adults that try to practice from Shnayis Baal Peh, this is a very easy Mishnah, as it only has 7 words. The Mishnah mentions a custom that was observed after people left the Beis Hamikdash on the last day of Sukkot. The adults would grab the children who love them from the hands of the children and eat the children's esregim. And it wasn't considered stealing because the Chachamim were mated this minig for the sake of enhancing the joy of the mitzvah, and they have the power to declare a person's property ownerless. The adults were allowed to eat only the esregim with the children and not the esregim of other adults. An adult's esreg is also because it was set aside to be used for the mitzvah and may not be used for anything else, which is a form of muksa that applies even a chol hamoed. Even after the mitzvah was performed, it remains aser in light of the halacha stating that whatever was muksa at the beginning of the day remains muksa for the entire day. The esrog of a child, by contrast, is permitted because it was set aside only for the purpose of the mitzvah of chinuch and not for a real mitzvah. Mishnah Ches, Hahalal v'Simcha Shmoina. The Mishnah goes back to discussing the other mitzvahs that we have on the Yontif of Sukkot. So the Mishnah says the mitzvahs of Halal and Simcha apply for 8 days. Ketzad, how do we understand this? Teaches us that a person is mechuyev in the mitzvah of Halal, the mitzvah of Simcha, and honoring the last day of Yom Tov Shmini Atzeres Kishar Kol Yemei Chag. Just like he's mechuyev on all other days of Yom Tov, just like on all the other days of Sukkot. Covered Yom Tov means honoring the Yom Tov means, among other things, preparing yourself for that day, washing yourself, cleaning up the house, setting up the table, and wearing clean clothing. People, halacha, you're supposed to have begadim that are miyuchet for Yom Tov, just like you have clothing special for Shabbos. You're supposed to have something special for Yom Tov as well. And because every day of Sukkot has a unique korban musaf, the entire halal is recited on each day, as we mentioned in Mishnah Aleph. Shmini Atzeres certainly requires its own recitation of halal, since it's an independent Yom Tov in many respects. We learned out of a pasuk that the chiyuv of Simcha and Yom Tov applies not only to the 7 days of Sukkot, but also on Shmini Atzeres. Sukkah Shiva, the Mishnah says that the mitzvah of Sukkah applies for 7 days. Ketzad, how do we understand this? What's the Mishnah teaching us? It teaches us that one finished eating his last meal on the 7th day of Sukkot, he shouldn't untie the bindings of his sukkah to take it apart, because the mitzvah of sukkah remains in force the entire day, being mechayev him. If he wants to learn, if he wants to take a nap, if he wants to eat another meal, he has to do so in the sukkah. The issue with eating another meal is that it's also Erev Yantiv, so you can't really eat after a certain point in the day, but if he wants to eat, he would have to eat in the sukkah, meaning the mitzvah is not batal. However, from the time of mincha, which is 2.5 hours before sunset, which is referred to as mincha ketana, and on, he may bring down into his house to find utensils and the bedding that he used in his sukkah. Because he gives honor to the last day of Yom Tov, Shemini Atzeres, by preparing for its evening meal in advance. Now it's Chol HaMoed, technically, so you could still be Meichen, and it's not an issue. And we mentioned before, the reason why it says Moirid es HaKelim, take the Kelim down, is because people often built the sukkahs on their roofs, as we mentioned earlier. Mishnah Tes. Nisuch Hamayim Ketzad. The Mishnah describes the mitzvah of Nisuch Hamayim that was performed each morning on the 7 days of Sukkot. Every day of the year there was Nisuch Hayayin that was poured on the Mizbeach by the Korban Tamid. On each morning of Sukkot, water was poured onto the Mizbeach at the same time as the Yayin. The mitzvah, which is called Nisuch Hamayim, was taught Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, but there are remazim for it in the Sukkim, like the Gemara says in Tainus, that there are extra on that base. In Tainus, that there's an extra mem, extra yud, and extra mem in the wording of the karbonis. When the Torah describes the karbonis of Chag HaSukkos, so the Gemara says that you have an extra mem, a yud, and a mem that spells out mayim, and we know that the Mishnah Rosh Hashanah tells us b'chag niden and alamayim. So the concept of water and the concept of mayim plays a huge role in the Yontif of Sukkot, and therefore we bring the Nisuch Hamayim to do that. So Nisuch Hamayim Ketzad, how is the mitzvah of Nisuch Hamayim done? Sloichet shel zav machzekah shloisha lugan hoy mamalev nashiloyach. A kohen filled a golden jug that would hold 3 lugan of water from the spring of the Shiloach, which was near Yerushalayim. It was then brought to the Beis Hamikdash in a procession with a parade. Higiu l'shar hamayim taku ve'riu v'taku. When they reached the Shar Hamayim, which is the southern wall of the Chatzar of the Beis Hamikdash, the Shar Hamayim was the entrance to the Chatzar closest to the Kebesh of the Mizbeach. It was given this name because this very ceremony described here, carrying the water into the chutzner, into the azara for the mitzvah of Nisach Hamayim, happened over here. They blew on their trumpets at Tekiah, true, and at Tekiah is an expression of joy, because the pasuk says, "Ushavta mayim v'sasoin," you should draw water with joy. So that's what we're doing over here. Allah b'kepesh hakohen ran up the ramp of the mizbeach carrying the jug of water. Panel l'smailoi. When he reached, meaning the think of it as if the mizbeach is on your right, and you're entering into the azara on your left, and when you come in, you're facing the ramp, and you would come in, you would have to make an immediate right to go towards the ramp. So when he reached the top of the Mizbeach, he turned to his left and walked to the southwestern corner of the Mizbeach. There were two silver bowls there, one in which a kohen poured the yayin of the daily carbon tamid, and one in which another kohen poured the mayim for the Nisach Hamayim every day on Sukkot. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shal sidhayu ala shahayu mushcharim p'neihem p'nei hayayin. The previous Tana said that the bowls were silver, but here Rabbi Yehuda says that the bowls were actually made out of plaster, which is white, but they had a silvery gray appearance to them because the surfaces had been darkened from the wine that was poured on them. Even the bowl used for the water looked silvery because the wine would sometimes pour into that bowl by mistake, which wasn't a problem. And they had holes. The bowls had holes in them like two thin nostrils. Each bowl had a spout at its base in which there was a hole giving the appearance of a nostril. Echad mu'uba ve'echad dak. The nostril of one bowl, the one that was used for wine, was wide to hasten the flow of the thick wine, and the nostril of the other one, the hole that was used for the water, was narrow, so that both of them, the water and the wine, would finish flowing out of the bowls at the same time. The wine of those times was very thick and flowed a lot slower than water. So in order to have both liquids finish flowing out of their bowls at the same time, the nekev, the hole that was made for the wine, was made wider than the hole that was made for the water. The water and the wine flowed from these holes, from these nostrils, onto the top of the mizbeach, and from there they drained into a hole in the top of the mizbeach that led to deep hollows beneath the mizbeach, which the Gemara describes. The word bereshis, it can be split into barashis, that a hole was created from sheshis and bereshis, and this takes us back to the concept of what Nisach Hamayim is really about. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu separated the Mayim Elyonim and the Mayim Tachtonim on the second day of Brias of the Sheshis Mebereshis, the Mayim Tachtonim said, "Anan be'ina dem heve kodem alka." The bottom water said, "We really want to be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not right that you're separating us from the waters that are going to be in the Elyonim." Obviously, this is not to be understood as physical waters in the Elyonim and Tachtonim. It's referring to spiritual ideas. But the idea was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mephias. HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeased the Mayim Tachtonim by saying that Klal Yisrael is going to be Misameach and bring the Nisach Hamayim, and that's the piyus for that will bring it to a state of Be'ina Demeheve Kadam Malka Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was the simcha of the mitzvah of Nisach Hamayim, which Mitzvah Shem will discuss by Arichos, in whichever capacity we'll get to first to talk about it, to Mr. Shem. Okay. Ma'arabi shal mayim, mizrachi shal yayin. The two bowls were side by side, one to the west and one to the east. Both bowls were located next to the keren on the southwestern corner of the Mizbeach. The Mishnah identifies which bowls were used for which nisuch. Not nusach, nisuch. The Ma'arabi shal mayim, mizrachi shal yayin. The western bowl was for the water, and the eastern bowl was for the wine. Nevertheless, if one poured from the jug of water into the bowl for the wine, or from the jug of wine into the bowl for the water, he was yetzer chiyuv, it's fine. The Mishnah said before that the required amount of water was 3 lugan. The first Mishnah of this parak taught us that it was poured on 7 days of Sukkot and not on Shmini Atzeres. Rabbi Yehuda argues with both points. Rabbi Yehuda says, the kohen would pour from a jug containing 1 lug on all 8 days, including Shmini Atzeres. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha that Moshe Rabbeinu gathered Har Sinai, the halacha that Moshe Sinai said that just as that you only need 1 lug of water, that's enough, and he maintains that just as the mitzvah of Simcha applies on all 8 days, so does the mitzvah of Nisach Hamayim, which is celebrated with great joy, as we'll see in the next parak, that the idea of Simchas Beis She'eva, Shemisham She'ev and Ruach HaKodesh has to do mainly with the fact of Ushavta Mayim B'Sasoin Imayne HaYeshua. Before the Kohen poured the water, he was given an instruction They will say to the one who poured the water, Hag beyotcha, raise your hand when you pour the water. He was told to raise his hand because it once happened that a kohen who rejected the oral law, who rejected the Torah Shabbat Peh, deliberately poured the water onto his feet instead of into the bowl. This kohen belonged to the Tzedukim, whereas it says over here the cult of the Sadducees, who accepted only Torah Shabbat and rejected Torah Shabbat Peh. They were thus opposed to the mitzvah of pouring water in Isach Hamayim, which was taught by Torah Shabbat Peh, Loich L'Moshe Misinai. And it's not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, so they wouldn't do that. But I guess he couldn't chicken out from the whole thing, so he had to, his way of doing it was to just pour it onto his feet. But and all the people pelted him with their esregim. From then on, they asked the kohen to lift his hands when he was pouring, so that they could see when he was pouring it into the bowl. It's very interesting, because till now, it didn't seem like they had any problems with him. They let him get away with it. They didn't see an issue with a kohen, gadol, or stama kohen that was a tzeduki, and until they see him doing something wrong. It's interesting why, maybe people who didn't do other mitzvahs very much celebrated the mitzvah Nisach Hamayim. I'm sure the Simchas Beis Sheva attracted a crowd, and the mitzvah Nisach Hamayim was part of it. So then, they were there for that. And I'm sure there were a lot of people that didn't see it as an issue. But Al Gapanim, the state, that Ragmu Kalam Besregayim, people pelted him with their Esregim because he did Shaloi Kedin. Mishnah Yud, K'masei B'achol, Kach Masei B'Shabbos. The Mishnah teaches how the mitzvah of Nisach Hamayim was done on Shabbos. Just as it was done on a weekday, so it was done on Shabbos. Ela she'im mamale me'erev Shabbos chavis shel zohav she'enu mekudeshes min hashiloach. Except that before Shabbos, the kohen would fill a non-kadosh golden barrel with water from the shiloach. The reason why they had one that wasn't kadosh, it was never used in the performance of any service in the Beis HaMikdash, and we'll explain in a minute why. Al-manicha balishka, and he would leave it in a room overnight to be used in the morning. Since he couldn't bring the water from the shiloach to the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos, because it's also to carry in Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos, he brought it to the Beis HaMikdash on Friday and left it there until the morning. The Mishnah said that before Shabbos they put the water in a non-kadosh vessel. They didn't use a kadosh vessel like they did in the other days of Sukkot for the following reason. When an item that's roy to be brought on the mizbeach, such as water, meat, or flour, it's put in a klishares for the l'shem avoda, and the item itself becomes kadosh, right? Meaning that if I put flour in a klishares for a mincha, so the flour becomes kadosh by me putting it into the bowl. As such, it is subject to the halacha of lina, staying overnight, which says that if something is kadosh, is left overnight, it may no longer be brought on the mizbeach. Therefore, if the water drawn from the shiloach would have been put into a klisharis on Friday and left overnight until it was needed Shabbos morning, it would become possible by daybreak under the halacha of lina. So to avoid this, the water was first put into a barrel that wasn't kadosh, and then Shabbos morning it was transferred into klisharetz, from which it was poured onto the mizbeach. Nishbecha oines galsa. The Mishnah tells us what was done with the water if it became unusable, if it spilled and you couldn't go back for more, if it spilled from the barrel or it became uncovered. Meaning, there's a problem of gilui also, which is discussed at length in the Gemara here. The concept of gilui is that if you leave water open overnight, then a snake might come and deliver some eres, drop some poison into the water, and then it will make it not right for use on the mizbeach. The kohen would refill a barrel of water from the kiyar. The kiyar was a large basin that stood in the azara of the Beis HaMikdash. The kahanim had to wash their hands and feet with water from the kiyar before doing any avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Although the kiyar itself was a klishares, the water that was left in it overnight did not become disqualified. This is because we discussed this in Masechta Yuma. This is because the kiyar was lowered each night into a well, so its water is merged with the water of the ground, losing its separate identity. And when the kiyar was brought up again, it had new water, which was not disqualified through the isra of lina. Shehayayin v'hamayim hamagulim psulim legabei hamizbeach. The reason why uncovered water may not be used is because wine or water that becomes uncovered is disqualified from being brought on the mizbeach. Uncovered liquids that were not washed are unfit for drinking because the snake may have drunk from them and left its venom behind. Such liquids are therefore disqualified for being offered on the mizbeach, because anything unfit to be served to a human king may certainly not be used for Melech Melech and Lochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu.